So today we're going to be going over an overview of fantastic literature. So I briefly want to comment on, we actually spoke about this when we talked about transactional theory and the importance of aesthetic engagement in the secondary world. And this idea of secondary world actually comes from Tolkien, the author of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Children are capable, of course, of literary belief. When the storymaker's art is good enough to produce it, that state of mind has been called willing suspension of disbelief. But this does not seem to me a good description of what happens. What really happens is that the storymaker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of the world. You therefore believe it, while you are, as it were, inside it. This suspension of disbelief is a substitute for the genuine thing. A real enthusiast is in an enchanted state. Secondary belief. So now we'll go over different forms of fantastic literature. Fantastic literature is an umbrella term that Rabkin uses to include everything from fantasy to science fiction to steampunk to horror to magical realism. So fantastic literature. Imagine narratives that explore alternative realities. An imaginary world, unlike the one we know, either completely different or with striking different elements. Events we experience that could not take place in the known world, with a reality that does not map onto the observable world as we know it, defying known laws of physics and science. Contains some element, character, setting, or plot that is not found in the real world. This could include elements that are magical or of the supernatural. Fantasy, rooted in folklore. Themes, stock plots, stock characters reflect folklore. May reference ancient myths and legends, like in Harry Potter or Percy Jackson and the Olympians, or Troy. Can you think of any others? If you can, take a chance and write them down and bring them to class so we can discuss them. So, distinctions from folklore. It is not oral in nature, but written down longer and more complex. The biggest difference between folklore and fantasy and fantastic literature in general is fantastic literature is far more complex. The antagonists and the protagonists are far more complex in terms of whether you can deem one good and one evil. It's not that black and white. There's too much gray. Folklore is not black and white, good guys versus bad guys. We know who is good and who is bad. Fantasy is varying shades of gray. It explores the ambiguities of life. And The Tale of Despereaux, wonderful novel, questionable movie, but definitely shows you that. The main character, Despereaux, is the hero, but the person that is cornered into the antagonist spot, we get to learn more about his history, and we understand that his evil is not actually evil. It's a manifestation of all the harms done to him. So it's not as simple as in the Snow White scenario. Snow White is obviously, the protagonist, and the antagonist is the witch. It's far more complicated in this situation. So fantasy, often the first literature that children experience through talking animal stories, such as Winnie the Pooh, Toad and Frog, Charlotte's Web. So what's this deal with the issue of people calling fantasy high versus low? Well, it's changed its meaning over time. Low fantasy set in the primary world we live in. So that would be something like Harry Potter and him, living in the Muggle world and then having to go on a special device in order to go to Hogwarts and to be a wizard. So that's set in the primary world. The fact that low is the qualifier is not making a judgment on the quality of the fantasy. High fantasy often occurs in secondary world where non-rational causality is postulated. Physical laws govern the secondary world. So things like The Hobbit, where it's a completely different world and it's completely detached from Earth, would be called high fantasy. Now, these terms have been used in various ways. So the idea of light fantasy recently came up. The seriousness of the questions that are asked and possibilities that are posed range from light fantasy to high fantasy, and from science fiction based on futuristic creations or inventions to that based on profound changes in our world. So now they're using the term light fantasy because low fantasy, low seems like it's a pejorative term, and it's not. But light isn't a pejorative term, but it's supposed to connote something like this fantasy isn't dealing with really important issues, and this high fantasy is. Devices such as time slips, magic objects, magical beings help create fantasy. There are many different types of fantasy. Not all of them are listed here. Animal fantasy, high fantasy, low fantasy, science fantasy, miniature worlds, literary lore, quest tales, alternative universe. So I'm just going to name some of the things that are around. So in the left-hand corner are the Smurfs. They're just walking along. Then we have a little picture from the novel Gulliver's Tales. Then we have a picture of a movie of a remaking of the Tale of Little Red Riding Hood. And next to that, The Hobbit by Tolkien. Below that, we get Charlotte's Web. Then we have The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman. Then we have Leviathan by Scott Westerfield. Then we have Twilight. Then The Tale of Despereaux, Hunger Games, The Underneath, Skellig, and Harry Potter. Now, how all these match up in different ways. The first things I need to say is that Hunger Games is science fiction, so it really shouldn't be on here. It should be on another slide. So we need to take that out. But we already talked about Harry Potter being considered low fantasy, not having anything to do with its quality, but the fact that the primary world, Harry goes between both worlds. And then, of course, Tale of Despereaux, animal fantasy. The Smurfs, they live in a miniature world, right? Now, where would Twilight go? That's a little bit harder to put. But in Twilight, who is in Twilight? Werewolves and vampires. And the stories of werewolves and vampires come from lore, folklore. So that would be attached to literary lore. The Hobbit, also being high fantasy, could also qualify as a quest tale. And we'll explore this a lot more in class. Something I did want to go over was science fantasy. Those of you familiar with Madeleine L'Engle, A Wrinkle in Time, this will be a lot easier to understand, but it's one of the novels that actually makes it the most clear. So in the novel, there are two ways to travel. There are 3 witches that use magic to travel throughout the universe, and then there's a scientist that developed a tesseract by using string theory. And actually in the novel comes these pictures explaining string theory and the ant and how you can bend time and place in half, and that's a way to travel. So it's a mixture of science and fantasy. So here's a quote from Rod Sterling. Fantasy is the impossible made probable. Science fiction is the improbable made possible. Now, to make sense of this, you can think of science fiction. Science fiction, the improbable made possible. Something's improbable when you're like, that's probably not going to happen. But it's not impossible. So a lot of scientific inventions, while they seem way out of our lifetimes, happen anytime soon, we're pretty convinced eventually they'll happen. For instance, when Star Trek was first developed and first came out, they were having flip phones, and they were having flat screen TVs and laptops and traveling through space. Many things which at the time were considered improbable, but not impossible. Technology was, moves very quickly. So there might be a way these things can happen. Unlike fantasy, where, it's pretty impossible to think of a world where there are hobbits and trolls and fairies running around. Possibly, but most unlikely, they're impossible. So the extrapolation of our knowledge of science and technology and our belief in progress in that makes it possible, and therefore it can help make the distinction between the two things of fantasy and science fiction. So science fiction, imaginative narratives that explore scientific possibilities, ranges from simple to complex speculation about the impact of scientific advances. Look for logical and imaginative exploration of potential impact of science, well-developed characters, logical, engaging, and believable plot, meaningful theme. So Clive Thompson is known for this quote, which has been contested. If you want to read books that tackle profound philosophical questions, then the best, and perhaps the only, place to turn these days is sci-fi. Science fiction is the last great literature of ideas. So before you start arguing with this, I want you to think about going into a bookstore. If you want to find Huxley's Brave New World, what section do you go to? You go to literature section, right? It's science fiction, but you go to literature section. So if you want to find Orwell's 1984, what section do you go to? The literature section. But if you want to get something that's more contemporary, like, a steampunk novel or something, you're going to go to the science fiction fantasy section, which is regulated away from the literature section. So for the longest time, it's had a stigma on it as not being as good as literature, not bringing up as many lofty ideas. So Thompson's putting it out there that science fiction has become the place where people are willing to experiment, are willing to put forth new ideas, while literature, haughty literature, is being held back. Writers are afraid to go as far as science fiction or fantasy writers would in terms of thinking of the universe and the various challenges we face, and really going head on with tackling issues. And we can discuss whether you agree with this or not in class. So common themes in science fiction: mind control, to boldly go where no man has gone before, sociological, anthropological, political, and environmental aspects of life in the future, survival. The Hunger Games is a dystopian novel. It's considered dystopian because it's about the future, and it's about a future that's been corrupted due to political and anthropological, sociological issues, war. The Giver is also dystopian because it's in the future, and community society has changed due to notable reasons, and it's a future that looks bleak to many of us. And within it, there's mind control. Feed is a young adult novel written by M.T. Anderson about the future where everybody is connected with internet devices in their heads. And it's kind of a world where technology has really taken over to the point where you start questioning humanity. The House of the Scorpion is by Nancy Farmer, and she, again, this is dystopian, and it's more based on sociological issues having to do with the drug trade, and also science issues having to do with the advances of cloning, what ends up happening. And, there ends up being a new oppressed class. And in terms of Star Trek, it's about travel, to boldly go where no man has gone before, to go out of our known universe to discover new worlds and new peoples. Fantasy and science fiction. Because fantasy and science fiction often deal with the complexities of existence, reading it can be a significant experience, building readers' values and beliefs. Grand themes: good versus evil, life and death, courage versus fear, love and hate, what it means to be human, consequences of pride. Many of my students often see the theme of dark and light, which they associate with good versus evil, or the devil versus angels, and definitely read into the books, complex, lofty themes. For a while, fantasy was and science fiction was kind of disregarded as leisure literature. But as more and more books that are, considered science fiction, like Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, make their way out of the science fiction section into the literature section, it's proving itself to be just as much quality literature as any other type of genre. Evaluating the fantastic. The story meets the criteria for excellence in narrative fiction. The fantasy or future world is detailed and believable within the context of the story. The story events are imaginative, yet logically consistent within the world. So it needs to logically all go together. It can't have anachronisms within the world itself. If you set up a world where everybody communicates via their internet headset, then everybody needs to communicate via their internet headset. There would be no point for somebody having a landline. It needs to all logically make sense. Evaluating the fantastic. The characters are multidimensional with consistent logical behavior. The writing is rich and the structures are clear. The themes are meaningful, causing readers to think about life. So setting. Rich details that enable readers to envision time and place, usually the future in science fiction, alternative realities often with maps supplied, or fantasy accepted in the real world, or a combination of both. Can act as antagonist, symbol, or illuminate characters. So as you can see, I put a little Hobbit on there, and there's a little map of Middle-earth. And a lot of the times those maps are included because it's literally giving you a map into the book, a way to follow through the book and imagine the world in your head. Evaluating the fantastic setting. Readers may be led into the fantasy world through some device. A door, like Coraline. A magic object. In The Lion, the Witch, and the wardrobe was the entrance to the fantasy world. In Harry Potter, platform 9 3/4. The train is the device that moves the reader from the real world to the fantasy world. Readers may be led into alternative reality through some object, or through the belief of realistic characters in the fantasy setting, or through the extrapolation of scientific possibilities into a future world. Even though events may not be realistic, what happens must be logically consistent within the story world. If characters move through time, they do so for a reason. If the fantastic operates in the real world, there must be consistency in how real people are affected by the fantastic events. So there must be guidelines set down. There must be rules, just like the way we have the rules of gravity on Earth. There has to be some sort of rules that are dictating the way that the world works, this fantasy world works. So a good example of this is the time machine. Now, in science fiction, the consequences of particular scientific advances drive the plot. Now, the whole story hinges on the fact that he develops a time machine which allows him to see the future. And he sees the future as ultimately humans destroying our future and a bunch of creatures feeding on Eloys. But without him having made that time machine, there would have been nothing driving the plot forward. The plot wouldn't have worked. It needed that device. Characters. Both human and non-human characters should be recognizable beings with strong emotions. Main characters are multidimensional personalities. They behave consistently, respond to events in a believable fashion, grow and change across the course of the story. If a character lives in a realistic world, enters a fantasy situation, the character remains consistent across both worlds. And what that means is, it doesn't mean that the character doesn't change at all. It means that if Harry Potter is in the regular world, Muggle world, he's still a nerdy kid that wears glasses and talks in a certain way. He doesn't suddenly become ultra cool boy as soon as he boards the train and becomes a wizard. He's still sort of nerdy. He just happens to have a lot of wizard powers and everything. So there has to be, the character traits have to remain the same. His standing in that society can change because suddenly he's a wizard. He has a lot more power in a world where he can use his magic. So they don't have to remain the same. It's about consistency. These are some of the things I'd like you to consider. Consider whether a science fiction and/or fantasy novel can serve as a window and/or mirror. Use The Arrival, or if you read The Ear, the Eye, and the Arm, as an example. What is the value of teaching fantastic literature? Do you think there is a value, or do you think it's some sort of distraction? Please pause the video and make a note. Fantastic literature. The metaphorical nature of fantasy allows children to consider death, prejudice, war, and other serious issues in a manageable way. It is less threatening because it is fantasy. It raises questions about society, tackles moral issues, and considers ethical dilemmas. The Arrival is a perfect example of this. Since it's wordless, it can be interpreted in a variety of ways, and some of them very scary ways. And don't be afraid to go there when you're writing your response, whether you have a particular interpretation of something that sounds horrific or otherworldly. If that's your interpretation, and it is intended to be pretty dark in certain places. Why fantasy and science fiction? Well, some reasons: expands the imagination, it considers important questions, creates wonder, fosters thinking about values and ideals, and offers wonderful stories about outstanding writers to stretch the soul. So we'll go over a lot of this in class, but please consider some of those questions and prompts that were relayed to you earlier on, and I hope you enjoy reading The Arrival.